Right, so for a little while now, people have been asking me to look at the GTX 1070, and they've been going very cheap over on eBay, with this one here apparently costing me about £48. The seller probably wasn't all too happy about that, to be honest, but that seems to be what they're going for. But yes, a damp box has just showed up on my doorstep, and this apparently is my EVGA GTX 1070, which is one of the nicer ones, but these are going for next to no money in all forms. So why don't we get this open and see what we've actually got. Oh, there is some bubble wrap. It may have survived, and it actually looks in nicer condition than the photos led me to believe. It's a bit dirty, a bit dusty, but nothing a bit of a cleanup won't do. And it still has the original EVGA seal, so that should be a good sign. But it does probably mean we need to change the thermal paste. So yeah, as you can see there, GTX 1070, I believe these were 8GB, 8G, so yeah, product number, 8G, 8GB 1070, and these really are about £40 to £60 right now, and a similar price in dollars, so why don't we get this plugged in and double check it actually works. So not too long ago, I had nothing but praise for the 970, which do go for quite a chunk cheaper than these, but in that video everyone was saying it's not the 970 I should be talking about, it's the 1070, because, well, I mean, it does have more VRAM, it does have more power. Despite the similarities that Maxwell and Pascal have, Pascal is newer, and I have seen that architecture mean big improvements in games. Oh, and it lights up as well, that's pretty cool. It just needs the one 8-pin as well, so we will do some power consumption testing, but if it's anything like the 970, these shouldn't actually use too much power. So the last driver update was June 16th, 2026, which is only security and bug fixes, but given that we live in a very DirectX 12 and Vulkan world where it's all low-level APIs, that should be fine. I can't really see there being any problems with that. I'd rather have bug fixes and security than nothing at all, because look at the state of AMD's GCN cards. They are struggling a lot more than you think in certain titles. Ridiculous, I know, but I'm actually not all too familiar with the 1070, so I don't know what the specs are, but you do get 1920 unified shaders, which is pretty good, 64 RPs, 120 TMUs. The EVGA variant does have substantially decent boost clock, 1785. We'll double check how that actually is in 3D Mark. Yeah, all checks out absolutely fine. I mean, it's even got a decent 256-bit memory bus, which you don't see on modern cards. 2016 though, this is a 10-year-old card. I can't quite wrap my head around that being a decade old, because I remember the moment they came out. And then the market got boring. They're cheap now, so let's run it through 3D Mark and see what it actually does. See if it's overheating. I want to say it's probably fine. Usually these EVGA ones stay cold enough that it's not too much of a problem. If you buy a blower one, yeah, you better be prepared to clean them. This, I could honestly, for the price these are going for, already I think this could be the king of priced performance. Because when I made this video on this cheap little Radeon that you can whack into any system, people that didn't care about power consumption or form factor just said, buy a 1070, they cost the same price. And they're not really wrong. So if you are someone that has at least a single 8-pin and probably an okay power supply, let's see what kind of performance it gets. Yeah, okay, so I was going to say 20 to 30 FPS is around the range of the 1060 and most Polaris cards. This is getting firmly up into the mid-30s. And out of the box, I actually don't think this needs anything. I know the 1070s don't run particularly hot, but yeah, we're talking about 73.5 degrees under peak load. I mean, looking at the graph, most results are coming in slightly before ours, which I'd imagine would be blower variants and non-overclock variants, and then this 1070 runs slightly better. So in terms of real actual frame rate, that's probably 1 or 2 frames per second. But yeah, I'm just going to let it run firmark and just make sure it's not overheating, but I think this seems fine. I just want to see the gaming performance and see what it can actually do. Yeah, let's just see how it gets on with firmark. I can't imagine it's going to be too bad, and is entirely limited by power. Can we just increase the power limit? Oh, wow, yeah, you can just increase the power limit. It draws another 20 watts, but what does that mean for performance? Even if it's only a smidge better, it's still free performance for doing very, very little. No undervolting here. That's the only problem with the Vega cards, is you do have to tweak them down to get them to where you want them to be. These work just out of the box. Yeah, it's now leaped up to around 40 frames per second in actual sort of gameplay load. So by just dragging that simple slider, we've actually gained a decent chunk of performance. I'd imagine boost clocks are probably looking, yeah, slightly more stable than where they were before, but nothing too drastic, and it's gained us around 2 degrees in peak temperature. See how the 1070 works with it out of the box, and if it handles that fine, we'll try some Unreal Engine 5 Slop. So Cyberpunk's loading up, we've got MSI Afterburner running, all we've done is increase the power limit and the game is on its default settings. I've not touched the defaults because I just want to see what the out-of-box experience with. You are someone that has bought one of these for 40, 50 quid, you've slapped it in your computer, and you've just launched a game. And I'm curious what it's going to do with its default settings. So it's getting about 50 frames. It looks really crisp. It's getting about 50 frames per second. It is using about 5 gigs of VRAM, so thankfully we've got 8 in here. Yeah, this is running smooth, really smooth. The frame time graph is just a straight line. There's no shimmering going on. On the 970 it did launch with an old version of FSR, so either this is new FSR. Oh no, it's completely native. So it's running with high settings. High settings, fancy effects on, no upscaling, in 1080p, and it runs Cyberpunk at about 50 frames per second. Yeah, no complaints for games up to Cyberpunk because out of the box, you aren't even going to have to rely on FSR, any upscaling technology. It is just going to run really well. Yeah, I mean, I've got no problem with FSR in this game, but it is getting about 40 to 50 frames per second here. So yeah, that's not a problem. Cyberpunk runs perfectly fine, pretty much maxed out on a 1070. Well, not maxed out, but close to it. Samson is a 30 FPS experience on virtually everything we've ever tested. Will it run on a 1070? There are certain games that just don't work well. And this is one of them. Virtually all entry-level cards we've ever tested run this fairly poorly. It's getting about 50 frames per second in Samson, which is unheard of. Okay, it has got FSR on. No, we're under 30 frames per second, but that did look a lot better. What about quality? Okay, quality works well and doesn't look as shimmery. So Samson here with medium settings. This game can actually look really good. I actually can't believe it. Even the worst I have of Unreal Engine 5 Bloat is seemingly capable of getting about 30 to 50 frames per second here. It's far more than I was expecting. I also can't tell if Samson's car just blew up there because it's still going forward. We have now reached a point with the advent of the GTX 1070 getting cheap that even when you throw up the stuff that shouldn't work, like this, Samson does not run well. It is able to manage it, admittedly, thanks to AMD's FSR, at 30 to 50 frames per second. Now, I will get the actual figures later, but once again, this is not a bad-looking game in places. This is actually the highest and most stable frame rate I've ever seen it produce. I mean, yeah, it's maxed out the graphics card, but 1070 everyone, even unfazed by Samson in the year of 2026, is ridiculous. That's about all I can say. The tweaking takes 2 seconds. It runs everything out of the box pretty well. Now's the time we actually need to get the real figures and see just how good it is. Because I don't think anything's going to be able to top it. On with the video. Now, Nvidia's GTX 1070 doesn't really need much of an introduction. I mean, it's pretty much from the generation 10 years ago where we reached peak Nvidia performance and have seen very little in the way of development since, at least from terms of generational leaps. This is what people class as the last real standpoint. And it has the specifications to back it up, being based on the GP104 architecture, which was the legendary Pascal coming in on 16nm. Of course, being a competitive card at the time, it did come with 8GB of GDDR5, running through a rather impressive 256-bit memory bus. The state of things in 2026, though, 10 years on from its initial June 2016 launch, means that you are only getting security and bug fixes in terms of driver updates. The thing is, we live in a very DirectX 12 and Vulkan world, where low-level APIs are sort of meant to do a lot of the optimization work, so it doesn't impact you as much as you'd think it should. You have 1920 pixel shaders, 64 ROPs, 120 TMUs, and power consumption that Nvidia officially states as a 150 watt TDP, which is actually surprisingly accurate. The thing is though, these specifications actually look pretty decent on paper by today's standards, because, well, it doesn't really feel like we've progressed on from the 1070 generation. I mean, already as we've seen in that intro, it's handling even the hardest of UE5 slop absolutely fine. So Pascal's a bit of a weird one, because for a 16nm process, it's power efficient, and packs some pretty good punches in the mid-range on specs alone. You can pick these up for around £40 with less than stellar examples, all the way up to £60 to £70 if you're looking at buy it now options or buying it from CEX with a 5-year warranty. And generally these prices are the same across Europe, the UK, a lot of America. This card's sold in absolute droves, so they are absolutely everywhere on the used market. But one area I have come to really appreciate about these Pascal cards, and to a degree the generation beforehand Maxwell, is Nvidia did set these cards up pretty much perfectly from the factory. All you have to do is plug them in and they are ready to go, because in terms of tweaking, most of them have pretty good boost clocks out of the box, so for the average person, all you really need to do is raise the power limits, and you'll gain maybe an extra 100 points in Time Spy. That's what we gained here. It just helped the frame rate remain a bit more stable, but you don't have to faff about undervolting or anything like that to get peak efficiency and stability. It just works fine out of the box. I will give Nvidia plenty of credit for that. In terms of a progression across 3D Mark synthetic benchmarks, we see exceptional DirectX 11 performance. Much like the previous generation's Maxwell architecture, DirectX 11 was sort of the API everything was running on at the time, and this absolutely dominated in it. Although saying that, it doesn't deal with DirectX 12 too badly, with Time Spy and Steel Nomad Lite giving really rather respectable scores, and even Full Fat Steel Nomad delivering over 1,000 points. And Full Fat Steel Nomad, as you'll likely know, is a brutal benchmark that is heavy on VRAM and heavy on full DirectX 12 features. So seeing that kind of score out of a 1070 did actually surprise me. In terms of comparisons to other cards, it's sitting actually at a pretty good spot in the graph, being very comparable to the RTX 3050 in terms of raw performance and a 980 Ti. Of course the 980 Ti is cheaper, but it's also older, and the 1070 does have more VRAM. Then again, the RTX 3050 still sells for about £100 to £200, so you are saving a decent chunk of money by going with the older 1070. That, and it's a cooler sounding name as well. In terms of comparison in Full Fat Steel Nomad, which is reminiscent of the most harsh UE5 titles out there, we see a similar story. It matches the RTX 3050, it loses slightly to the 980 Ti purely because it has less power there, but it isn't comparing itself to modern cards like the 6700 XT, if you can still call that modern, where it's delivering around 1,000 points less. The thing is, though, I have included the Nvidia Quadro M4000 on here, which is quite reminiscent of what a GTX 970 would be like if it had 8GB of VRAM. That's essentially what the card is, and we can see that in terms of a generational uplift over the previous generation, when you take VRAM out of the matter, which is exactly the case in here with Steel Nomad, we are seeing around double the performance. So in terms of a mid-range card, after a long enough time when games are getting more intensive, you can expect to see double the performance of the previous generation. We don't see that anymore, and that is exactly why the 1070 is so impressive. Now, there's no point me doing a history segment here because, like I've already said, it feels like time has been frozen in the GPU space for the last 10 years. Yes, we've had ray tracing and things like that, DLSS and all of these new features crop up, but in terms of raw rasterization performance, it feels like Pascal was the peak of it. And pretty much everyone that is watching this channel will have heard of this card. They will remember the launch, and if they didn't remember the launch, well, they've damn well heard of the card. So there's no point covering what it is and where it came from. The name alone tells you exactly what you need to know. Today we're benchmarking with a Ryzen 7 3700X, 32GB of DDR4, just to get that out of the way that we are not CPU bound in any instances, and also I have gone above and beyond with the benchmarking, getting a little bit carried away here, just to show you how much power this card has on paper. I mean, sure, it's not AMD's Vega 56, but architecturally, like we've seen before, benchmark scores don't mean everything when you translate that into games. And the best way of showing you that, well, it's to run the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which of course does utilise the new DirectX 12 API in comparison to the last generation's DirectX 11 one, with very high settings in 1440p, which was pretty much a necessity to actually put some load on the card because it deals with 1080p absolutely fine here. We returned 77 frames per second on average, with solid frame times with 1% lows down to 68 frames per second. So this is the game running with its very high preset turned on, and is about as high as you can realistically go, with without having ray tracing, which of course you don't have here. This is the last generation of true rasterization performance. Moving over into World of GTA Online Enhanced Edition, which can prove a little bit more intensive in some of those larger lobbies because I always try and benchmark over 16 players, we saw 73 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 64 frames per second, so a slight dent to the average, a slight dent to the 1% lows, but still firmly over 60 frames per second. So for the new GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, no problems at all on a 1070, and you'll need to up the resolution to actually get, well, some load put on the card. Not that I really want to focus too much on legacy benchmarks because, let's face it, a lot of these titles haven't been updated and there are 10 years worth of benchmarks out there in case there's a specific game you're looking for. We're mostly going to focus on newer titles, but GTA 5 Legacy goes to show that the 1070 really was a bit of a powerhouse in DirectX 11. Now, running GTA 5 Legacy with ultra settings, PCSS shadows, that's all of the advanced options turned on, all of normal options turned on in a 1440p resolution, which, to be fair, I do think looks better than the enhanced edition, runs at around 60 frames per second in single player, averages of 59 FPS, 1% lows down to 52. The thing is though, single player doesn't really matter. The only reason you'd be looking at GTA 5 Legacy would be to play it online with friends that are stuck on older systems. So taking the exact same maxed out settings and moving into the world of GTA Online, we saw a rarity here, with our average actually going up to 66 frames per second and 1% lows still hovering in around 55 FPS. Now, GTA Online Legacy is notoriously terrible for optimizations, but seemingly the GTX 1070 has enough brute force power to actually increase the frame rate still, which is something you don't often see. So yeah, GTA 5 Legacy, it's always run fine, but it's worth double checking online still just to make sure it is still running okay, in which case it's still one of the rare instances we see GTA Online deliver more frame rate than single player. One of the most optimized titles of recent years is Ark Raiders, based on Unreal Engine 5, but not in a way that makes it completely unplayable on any hardware. In this instance, we turned it up to high settings to actually put some load on the card because lower settings run perfectly fine, and you can run the game without any form of anti-aliasing, but really Ark Raiders does benefit from having some sort of upscaler anti-aliasing type going on. I had FSR here running with native anti-aliasing, which is actually more intensive than just running without any anti-aliasing, but it does make the game look better. I mean, it just covers up some jaggy edges where you aren't meant to see them. We return averages of 48 FPS, 1% lows down to 43, and these figures were taken during heavy combat or during areas with heavy foliage, so this is about a worst case scenario for what you're going to see on the cards. If you were actually interested in getting over 60 frames per second, you can either lower your settings a little bit or just turn FSR down. I mean, you could just have it on quality or balanced and it will push you up over 60 frames per second and isn't gonna look too different. But here I just thought, you know what, we'll really try and stress things out on the GTX 1070 just to see if it can manage it, and yeah, Ark Raiders high settings with anti-aliasing instead of any form of upscaling works perfectly fine. For people actually looking at getting into Counter-Strike 2 on a budget, a lot of the time we joke about it because some of the terrible cards we test, but I genuinely do think you could get away with some genuinely competitive gameplay if you are using a GTX 1070 and a high refresh monitor. The built-in workshop benchmark is very reminiscent of simpler scenarios, so think your Office, your Dust 2, your Mirage, your Inferno, those simpler and easier to run maps. You'll get in and around 278 frames per second, with 1% lows down to 254. And this is in a 1080p resolution with competitive settings, so low everything and dynamic shadows enabled. It's pretty much going to run flawlessly. I will say though that I always do go ahead and benchmark one of the newer maps out here, such as Cache, which does put a noticeable dent in your overall average, now down to 166 frames per second, and 1% lows down to 134. Now, if you're playing in a 1080p resolution, this could be something of a detriment. However, a lot of people are now playing in stretch 1280 by 960, which I don't have the exact figures on hand for, but does comfortably push you above that 200 FPS range if that's something you're interested in. Either way, this felt smooth enough. If you had a 144Hz monitor, you're pretty much going to be fine either way. So Counter-Strike 2, still perfect on the 1070, even on the newer maps.
Now, I have been having a lot of fun benchmarking BeamNG version 0.39. As most of you that play this game will know, this game has brought significant uplifts to the graphics, and also the system requirements as well. On a GTX 1070 though, we were able to manage it with high settings, and I increased the reflection updates to 4 times, which didn't actually change our overall frame rate at all, and did make the reflections a lot smoother. For some reason it defaults to 1 times on a 1070, and just means the reflections on your car look like a slideshow rather than an actually constant updating image. Either way, this was done in the jungle map with traffic enabled, just to fill up the VRAM and really put some load on the card. And how does it deal with it? Keep in mind this is a really rather intensive update and benchmark. Well, being pretty much the king of pure rasterization performance in the mid-range of its time, it achieved 39 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 33. Simpler maps and scenarios running without traffic or running with lower settings would net you over 60 frames per second, but even as a worst case scenario here with some fancy effects turned on, it's still going to be in and around 30 to 40 FPS. We have already seen a little bit of Cyberpunk 2077, as that was the first thing we tested on the card, but in terms of actual settings and frame rate, when running with the high preset and a full native 1080p resolution, we returned 47 FPS on average and 1% lows of 42 FPS. Now, these figures aren't taken from the built-in benchmark, that tends to be a tad too optimistic. This is taken from real-world gameplay causing a lot of havoc, a massive wanted level, and just putting full load on the card. And our frame rate pretty much stayed between these two figures here. It was between 40 and 50 frames per second, often going above this when not much was going on, but never really going beneath 40 FPS. Overall, Cyberpunk was pretty much a great experience, and if you were someone looking at eking out a full 60 FPS experience, you can either lower the settings, you can lower the resolution, or personally, enable FSR3. FSR3 works exceptionally well on Pascal cards, and will easily be enough to push you above 60 frames per second without too much of a detriment to the image quality. Cyberpunk fortunately has a good implementation, so is one of the few instances where I'd say, you know what, go for it. Oblivion Remastered sort of verges in on, it's a good game, it's a good remaster, but it doesn't run particularly well on older hardware. In fact, most GCN 1-3 cards pretty much can't play the game at all. So how is it running on a GTX 1070? Well, it definitely struggled more than I thought it would, and you have to keep in mind this game has a really awful FSR implementation, but one that you will need to use to achieve over 30 frames per second. It's actually worth noting that you're better off keeping the game with a 30 FPS cap here and probably raising the settings more, because it'll be smoother. For some reason, there was a constant hitching and stuttering that took around 3 to 5 minutes of gameplay to actually clear up. Once you'd actually got through this, it would go away. I don't know if it was some hidden shader compilation or something like that going on in the background, but it did take longer than I expected to actually clear itself up. Either way though, for a game that is notoriously hard to run and came out quite recently, it does play on a 1070 and it's not too bad. Personally, I'd spend some time configuring the upscaling probably outside of the application because it looks awful here. It's so smeary, but instead that's not a complaint about the car, that's a complaint about the game, but yes, it does run. I did really quite enjoy playing through Samson when it came out. However, it is a game that I haven't really experienced above 30 frames per second, and we pretty much haven't seen any budget graphics card able to handle it. Because of this, it's pretty much become my Unreal Engine 5 slop test. If it can run Samson, it's probably going to handle most Unreal Engine 5 titles to some capacity. With medium settings though, and FSR3 set to quality mode like we saw earlier, I have got the actual figures for you, and this was taken from an extended gameplay session in a full HD 1080p resolution. We returned 44 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 36 FPS, with the occasional hitching and stuttering that happens when you're passing under bridges. It is particularly brutal on these older cards with the shadows that are going on. The game didn't actually look too bad. In fact, this is probably the best we've seen it look on this channel to date. So yeah, Samson's playable. I'd probably cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second if you are playing it on a 1070, but it's not so much the game that we're referring to here, it's the fact that Unreal Engine 5, when it's almost at its very worst in terms of intensity, it works fine. You can still play it on a 1070, which is a good indication for future titles to come. As always, we do have to test the popular Battle Royale titles, and we are starting here with PUBG. Now, PUBG, you can run it in DirectX 12 mode, however, there isn't any real reason to do so. Pascal is an architecture that is exceptionally good at DirectX 11, and PUBG offers you the option to run DirectX 11.1 if you select DirectX 11 Enhanced in the options menu. I decided to run the game with high settings in 1080p just to put some load on the card, and it ran perfectly fine. We saw averages of 111 FPS and 1% lows down to 96, and keep in mind this is with high settings. People that are properly into their PUBG tend to play it with very low settings, or there's a competitive setup they use, where you would easily see an excess of 150 to 200 frames per second, which just seems excessive in a title like PUBG. So PUBG, it works fine on a 1070, it always did, but it's one of those ones that just got better and more optimized with age, and 1070 performance is now actually offering you really solid averages, and not half bad frame times either. In a similar vein to PUBG, Fortnite ran spectacularly well, however it does now default to a DirectX 12 mode, which was Performance DirectX 12, and I left it running with medium settings, just to put, once again, some load on the card, because you could run it with low, you'd likely see a slightly higher average, but it depends on how you really want to play the game. In terms of Fortnite, most people are trying to get the highest frame rate possible, and I'd say this is quite indicative of the experience you'll get when you just click play on the title, because these are the settings it's going to use. It deals with DirectX 12 fine. Once again, I don't really have all too many gripes with Nvidia's DirectX 12 performance. I know people did back in the day, but it doesn't seem to have aged too badly, at least in things like Fortnite. We saw averages of 188 FPS, 1% lows down to 167, and this was all in a 1080p resolution, so really you could cap the frame rate if you didn't want to drop a single frame, you could increase the resolution if you want some more load on the card, because trust me, you've got the overheads and the frame rate to sacrifice. Yeah, Fortnite isn't really going to be a problem for your 1070. I'm not a huge fan of benchmarking S&Box, S&Box, however you want to call it, because it's actually hard just to gauge the performance of how it's going to run and what game mode you should use. I loaded up into the new remake of Construct, which does put quite a heavy load on the VRAM of the card. Fortunately, having 8GB of it wasn't too much of a problem, and this was with the default medium and high settings in 1080p. Where it would run, it's seemingly around 40 to 100 FPS most of the time, even when you were just spawning in tons of stuff and causing explosions. However, it couldn't handle the little sausage men. Mostly just the ones that were your enemies. It could handle the allies fine, but there was something I spawned in where I was wondering what was killing my frame rate, bringing me down to around 8 FPS on average. And it was these little guys, and I don't know what was causing it. It doesn't seem to do this with other cards I've tested, but does seem to do it on the 1070, so could be a bug with the game. I say could be a bug, it probably is, because other than that it ran fine, but probably something to keep in mind. Paralives is a particularly brutal test for the GTX 1070. You've got to remember it is only receiving security and bug fix updates, and Paralives is a newer, popular indie title which will have had absolutely no optimizations done driver side for. Keep in mind this is also DirectX 11, so this is where those type of optimizations really do matter. With high settings we saw pretty much the same frame rate we saw with low and medium, so it made more sense to keep it turned up to high, and in a 1080p resolution the game was decently playable with 46 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 29 FPS. The middle of town when things were loading in put a lot of load on the entire system, so I don't think this was entirely the fault of the 1070, however it was struggling as it filled up the VRAM on the card, so it is something certainly at play there. Generally though, Paralives with these settings on these older cards proves rather intensive, but still achieving 46 FPS, I would say that's still playable and admirable given that this is a newer title out, and this is a 10-year-old card that has zero optimizations for it. It's always worth trying M&B Bannerlord just because it seems to run spectacularly well on virtually all forms of hardware, so how is it going to deal with pretty much the bastion of DirectX 11 technology? Keep in mind this is also a DirectX 11 title. Well, with ultra settings in 1080p, you have got plenty of headroom to spare. This benchmark scales with the settings used, so Ultra also has more people in the benchmark and thus more load on the processor and the card. Keep in mind the processor was fine throughout this benchmark, and we returned 91 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 69 frames per second. And keep in mind, given this is reminiscent of the late game, that pretty much means that all of the early to mid game is going to run in well excess of 100 FPS. It also looks really good with these settings used, so M&B Bannerlord, we already knew it was going to run well, but this just goes to show you that, yeah, it can handle DirectX 11 titles perfectly fine. I do remember Red Dead Redemption 2 being a very popular title for testing on cards like the 1070, so I wanted to know how it performed myself, and people always love seeing Red Dead 2 tested. I turned the game right up to ultra settings, so that was going through the settings menu and just dragging the slider all the way to the right, so I can probably throw up the settings menu for you now, because Red Dead 2's settings menu, you'd just spend half the benchmark talking about the settings otherwise. Still, we did return 40 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 33 FPS, and this was the same during built-up areas, busy areas, and actually busy scenarios, so Red Dead 2 pretty much works perfectly fine on a 1070 as I expected it to, and if you were looking at getting over 60 FPS, you could just drag that slider down midway and it would probably boost you over it. So Red Dead 2 works perfectly fine, and with that 8GB of VRAM, you can configure the settings menu yourself if you really wanted to. It's only when you get around 4GB and under that the game doesn't let you. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? This one I did want to shoehorn in, and the reason I wanted to shoehorn it in was, this is about as hard as it gets to run with DirectX 11 titles. This is about as brutal as you can get with the old school rendering techniques that the old Pascal architecture was always designed for. And high settings here is particularly brutal compared to any settings beneath it. So I was surprised to see that a little 1070 was able to achieve nearly 60 FPS on average. Averages of 55, 1% lows down to 43. It did have a little bit of stuttering when we first loaded in, but this quickly went away. I would also say that the visuals it produced were spectacular, and it was nice to see the 1070 go out on a little bit of a high note. For what it was built for, it dominates in. But it's also good to come to this point at the end of the benchmarks and say, you know what? It deals with what it was made for particularly well, but that doesn't mean that it can't absolutely dominate in modern titles. So, overall performance of the GTX 1070. And in certain titles, no, it's not quite matching the similarly priced AMD Vega 56, but once again, this has been a very plug-and-play experience where the card tends to do absolutely fine. I think one of my biggest takeaways here is the Unreal Engine 5 test, because it's a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, but lots of us that are on this lower end segment of the market have probably noticed that cards with under 6GB of VRAM, or cards that don't receive at least some form of modern driver updates, even if it is just bug fixes, pretty much can't run these titles. So when you take a game like Samson, which we've pretty much seen is unplayable on most cards we've tested since we added it to the benchmarking suite, we suddenly go from it being unplayable to, oh, this runs. Which is indicative of not just the game itself, but a lot of titles that are in a similar state of optimization where you are going to need a card like this to be able to play them. And the 1070 is really about as low as you can go, which in many ways is sort of a standout thing for the card, because it handles Unreal Engine 5 to this day fine. It handles games before this like Cyberpunk 2077 with arguably fantastic visuals, native resolutions and great frame rates, and when you're looking at the popular titles people are actually playing, take something like Fortnite or even Counter-Strike 2, you will be playing them fine with competitive frame rates even in the modern and more intensive game modes or maps out there. I mean, Counter-Strike 2 is testament to this because cache is a lot more intensive than the workshop benchmark would have you believe the game is. And even then, we're seeing it able to deliver above 144 frames per second in virtually all instances, which means if you've got an entry-level high refresh monitor, yeah, there's no reason why you can't use a GTX 1070, and that is where the power of the card is. It's a plug-and-play powerhouse. It genuinely is. It has blown me away by the fact that this card is one you just plug in, install the drivers, maybe increase a power limit if you're so inclined, and this is the type of gaming you can do. 10 years later. In terms of driver-side features, you get the standard Nvidia app, which is rather useful, especially given the plug-and-play aspects of this graphics card. It's one of the reasons for more inexperienced builders I struggle to recommend some of the Polaris series, and I do struggle to recommend some of the Vegas series in particular, where the first thing you're going to have to do when you set them up is undervolt them. For those of us that know what we're doing, not too much of a big deal. For those people that are just getting into this sort of budget segment, the convenience of giving someone a computer if you build it for them, and the Nvidia app just optimizes their game settings, because chances are they've never seen a settings menu before in their life. The Nvidia app does a good job there. One of the other things that it does struggle with is when it comes to the world of retro gaming. I do think that any AMD equivalent does certainly have the edge here, because it's much easier to do, it's much more responsive, and it oftentimes gives much better results. I did go through and do a couple of retro gaming benchmarks with the driver-side enhancements turned on, so you had your super sampling in there, you had your forced anisotropic filtering, you had your forced GPU scaling, and you know what, it does okay. You take something like Half-Life 2, it's going to look spectacular on the card, but you can eke out a few nicer options on AMD cards. I know this is a very minor criticism, but some people do care about this. And when you deal with older titles that are stuck in a 4:3 resolution, take something like Just Cause 1, it runs good, it looks great, and it does deal with GPU scaling absolutely fine. So when it comes to driver-side features, yeah, they work well, they're convenient if you're playing new titles. For older titles, they can be a little bit slow or a bit limited, but it'll look fine and it'll run fine too. You do also get included Nvidia NVENC encoding, which is nothing spectacular by today's standards, but does work well. So if you want to do some media encoding in, say, like Handbrake, OBS, which is how I did my recording, you can get some pretty solid recordings without having to push mega high bit rates, and it'll do okay. I mean, once again, it's a 10-year-old encoder, expect 10-year-old results, but it does mean you can whack this into a fairly mediocre PC, and yeah, you'll be able to record gameplay, and you'll be able to stream if you want to. You also do get the replay feature in certain titles like Fortnite, where it'll automatically go through and record your highlights as and when it needs to, so that does all still work. So if you've made it this far and you're thinking, wow, I really kind of want a GTX 1070, maybe you're someone running an old GTX 1050 or even something older like a 970. And yeah, at this point, it does seem like you should probably consider this as an upgrade, especially if they're this cheap. But how difficult are they to run? Well, in terms of power consumption metrics, I've got two figures here stock, and with the raised power limit, which is as simple as dragging a slider in MSI Afterburner. In terms of peak load in Firmark, which is where it boosts up to before it stabilised down, we saw 159 watts stock and 173 watts with the power limit raised on an already pre-overclocked EVGA model. Keep in mind, on reference models or simpler models with blower coolers, this is likely to be lower. In terms of gaming, you're looking around 150 to 160 watts depending on the state of tune, workstation tasks in around the mid-60s, and at idle it used around 10 watts, sometimes under this in around 5 to 10 watts. It's not a particularly power-hungry card, and how does this translate into thermal performance? Well, the EVGA cooler is lovely, and we've not even had to change the thermal paste, so you could probably get it better than this. At the end of the day, though, it's a card that tends to run around the mid-70s with most things you're doing. We saw peak temperatures in around the mid-80s when running Firmark, which is particularly brutal, but at the same time, the card didn't get loud, and it didn't get hot. Idle temperatures are slightly higher than you might expect, but that's because it just powers down the fans. So that is just it running with no fans and passive cooling, so it does tend to be a little bit higher than you'd expect. One area that did surprise me on the GTX 1070 though, is I managed to get this thing down to using just 60 watts of power with a power limit and an FPS limit in place. Oh, and more than that, it can play Cyberpunk when limited down to around 60 to 70 watts of power. That is how efficient Pascal is as an architecture. So if you're someone that's running with maybe a not too great power supply, but we're looking at getting one of these and wanted to use it while you're waiting to upgrade it, you can get an 8-pin on here, and provided you're running this with FPS limits in place and also a power limit in place set in MSI Afterburner, you can quite comfortably run Cyberpunk, admittedly with medium settings rather than high settings and FSR running here, but it is a 60 FPS experience at around a 60 watts power envelope. Yep, that is how easy it is to run a GTX 1070. These things don't use power, so if you really were so inclined to use it as a power efficient model, be my guest. So there we have it, Nvidia's GTX 1070, and is it obsolete 10 years after launch? Well, the market has stagnated so much that no, it really isn't. This card was overbuilt. It is the bastion of mid-range DirectX 11 technology, with also decent DirectX 12 support, and frankly, 8GB of VRAM. And given that we're still seeing 4GB cards come out today, yeah, it looks like the 1070 has still got plenty of life left in it. I really thought the kicker would be modern Unreal Engine 5 bloat like Samson. But no, it can power through it. With a 30 FPS cap in place, I'd probably play through the game quite happily on a 1070. So, I'm going to say, if you are looking for a graphics card right now, this is probably the card to get. Yes, you can get Vega 56s and 980 Ti's around this territory, both of which will be better, but the AMD card will require a bit more tweaking around on startup, and the 980 Ti will certainly be more power hungry, both of which will perform slightly better in most instances because they are more powerful cards. The Vega's got HBM, and the 980 Ti was the flagship, but they all perform pretty close in gaming to the stage where I'd say the 1070's the winner. It's got the best drivers, it has got the best power consumption, it's got the best thermals, and honestly, in terms of the frame rates you're getting, they're going to be close enough that you aren't really going to care. So is the 1070 obsolete? No, definitely not. This is a card that is probably in its golden era in terms of budget territories, because these things are getting so cheap where the people that did buy them are thinking, oh, maybe it's time I go for RTX, maybe it's time I go for an RX 7000 or 9000 series card. And you know what? That means for those of you on the budget end of the market, you are getting a really solid deal. No, there's no DLSS. No, there isn't any real form of ray tracing. But what you do get is a card that was so overbuilt for its era that Nvidia frankly hasn't made anything that's a worthy successor to this. And yes, I know that's a controversial take, but there are a lot of diehards out there that don't particularly care for DLSS or ray tracing or anything like that. They just want brute force power. And you know what? This offers it. So, anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Maybe I'll try and get a 1080 or a 1080 Ti, because frankly, if the mid-range was like this, how good is that high-end holding up? Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.